Hello and welcome to What's New in Historical Fiction, a regular panel series that features historical novelists with new and upcoming titles. I'm really excited that all of you could join us, and we're going to have a great panel here with some four really amazing authors with some really awesome new titles. My name is Colin Mustful. I'm the founder and editor of History Through Fiction, an independent press that publishes historical novels. We do this panel series on a fairly regular basis, about once every month or two. I actually have two scheduled in March, and those will go up on our Eventbrite page here in the next week or two. Give me just a second here. This session is being recorded, and it will be available on replay on YouTube, and it's also going to go up on Facebook. Just a couple quick housekeeping things. I have enabled everyone to be able to turn on their cameras. If you want to have your cameras on, go ahead. I do have our panelists spotlighted so they stay up on the screen. I do have your mics closed though, just so we don't have any interruptions. However, I would love for all of you to interact with us in the chat. So at the bottom of your screen, you should see a chat feature. If you just click on that, it'll open something up on the right panel, the chat box, and go ahead and please say hello. Let us know where you're joining us from, maybe what you're reading right now. It would be great to hear from you. One other announcement is that I put together a landing page with our four panelist novels, and that's at historythroughfiction.com/what's new in historical fiction. I'll share that link here in the chat right now, and I'll share it a couple times throughout the event. Oops, I put it in the waiting room. Just a second. Okay, there it goes. And those books are all linked to bookshop.org because bookshop.org gives back a percentage of book sales to independent booksellers. First of all, they source the sales through independent bookstores, and they give a percentage of the sale to those bookstores, so it helps keep them going. So we really like to support bookshop.org. Okay, without further ado, I'm going to exit from the screen and I'll have our panelists introduce themselves. So let's start with Elaine Neal Orr, author of Dancing Women. Elaine, if you could say hello and tell us about your novel.
Should I take about a minute? Does that sound right?
Well, whatever feels natural to you.
Okay, well, we want to all have a chance to talk and hear from the audience as well. So I'm Elaine Neal Orr. This is my third novel. All of my novels are historical novels. And in this one, a young white American woman in the early 1960s moves with her husband to northern Nigeria, which is in West Africa. He's working as an agricultural engineer with USAID. So she's moved from Virginia to northern Nigeria in the early 60s, and she's living among a population that's largely Muslim and that's speaking Hausa. And so you can imagine that she experiences some cultural shock, some culture shock. But she's also an artist, and she's an incredibly curious and strong-willed young woman. And so she begins to venture out into the country and to learn the language. And she becomes enamored with the art in the country. And she's also passionate. And early in the novel, she makes a precipitous choice. She goes to a party without her husband because he's off working. She goes with some other expats, and she has a one-night stand with a Nigerian British musician who's very alluring and reminds her of Harry Belafonte. And she goes home to her good husband. She doesn't want to ruin her marriage. A few days later, she's digging in her garden rather furiously, trying to work out her guilt, and she unearths an ancient sculpture, and it's a dancing woman. And that's how the novel begins. And it moves between these two poles of her her being torn between her own family obligations and her dedication to her family, and also her destiny, the call of her art, and this musician who seems to understand her soul more deeply or better than her husband does. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Elaine. Yeah, a lot of deep elements going on there. I look forward to talking to you more about it.
That sounds juicy.
Yeah.
There, it's been described as having some warm sex scenes. Okay. Uh,
Next, let's go to Julia Bryan Thomas, author of The Kennedy Girl. Julia, hello. Tell us about your novel.
Hi there. Thank you so much for having me. This is my newest historical fiction, The Kennedy Girl. It just came out about 2 weeks ago. It's my third historical novel, and it's a story about a young girl it's set in 1960. A New York girl is discovered and offered a job to model in Paris. And so with no ties, she decides to take a chance and go. And she loves the modeling business. It's so much fun. It's just, it's French, it's fashion, it's clothes, it's learning about the fashion world. But what she doesn't realize is that she has been being used as a spy, and she's caught by the United States government and given an ultimatum: either cooperate or else. And so it's a story about what happens to her. It's called The Kennedy Girl because her idol was Jacqueline Kennedy, and she makes a brief appearance in the book. So it's my third historical novel, as I said, but my first attempt at spy fiction. And I just had a ball doing it.
Wonderful. Thank you, Julia. Next, let's say hello to Rosa Kwon Easton, author of White Mulberry. Rosa, hi.
Hi everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight, and thank you, Colin, for inviting me here. I'm going to hold up my book real quick too because I love my cover so much, and I always try to dress like my cover a little bit just for fun. My novel is my debut historical novel, and it's inspired by the true story of my grandmother, a young woman coming of age in 1930s Japan occupied Korea. It follows the journey of Myung, an 11-year-old girl who has dreams too big for her poor farming village outside Pyongyang, um, now North Korea, but at the time it was one country. So she has the opportunity to follow her older sister to Japan to further her education and to avoid an arranged marriage. And she's elated. But once she arrives, she discovers that she must pass as Japanese to survive in a society that is rife with anti-Korean sentiment. It's a story of a woman torn between two worlds and her quest to reclaim her true self. Um, it's about love, resilience, and identity. And Julia, you talked a little bit about your title, and my title, White Mulberry, comes from a mulberry tree that my protagonist loves as a child growing up in her village. And the tree is uh, prevalent in the northern part of Korea and parts of China. And it represents the resilience that I found in my grandmother as I researched and interviewed her um, and wrote about her story. So that's where the title comes from.
Thank you, Rosa. And finally, let's go to Tiffany Warren, author of The Unexpected Diva. Tiffany, hi.
Hi. Good evening, everybody. Thank you for the invite, Colin. My book, The Unexpected Diva, is about the first Black prima donna in the United States. Her name was Elizabeth Taylor Greenfield. She had a wonderful 3-octave voice, and she toured America before the Civil War. I've been calling her the Beyonce of the antebellum. However, her stage name was the Black Swan, and she got that stage name because she was compared to the Swedish Nightingale, Jenny Lind, because they had such great voices, and Jenny Lind was the prima donna of the day. And one reviewer said, why do we need this European Jenny Lind, the Swedish Nightingale? Give us the Black Swan, because we had Elizabeth Taylor Greenfield, who was American. Um, so Elizabeth was born enslaved on a plantation in Mississippi, and she was freed as a child, and she was raised by her previous mistress in an abolitionist community in Philadelphia. She was educated and taught how to hone that 3-octave voice. But when her benefactor died, she left her a huge inheritance that was contested by Mrs. Greenfield, the elder Mrs. Greenfield's family in the South. And so at that point, Eliza had a choice to make. Would she go ahead and pursue that gift? Or would she do what everyone expected her to do, marry or take care of other people's children, or whatever anyone expected a woman to do, which was not go on tour and, chase her dream of being an opera singer. She did the unexpected, and she got on a steamer to Buffalo, and she was going to chase her dream. On that steamer, she met a Buffalo socialite, and she sang for her on the steamer, and the rest, as they say, was history. Her career took off from there, and she toured the United States. She did 2 tours that even included Canada, and she ended up singing for Queen Victoria in Buckingham Palace. But along the way, of course, there were lots of pitfalls and bumps and bruises, protesters, and lots of things that were obstacles in her path. But what I love about this story is that Eliza did it afraid. She did it anyway. She pursued her gift, and she trusted that her gift was going to make room for her. This is a very triumphant story, and I'm excited for people to read about Eliza.
Thank you, Tiffany. Yeah, well, one thing that's wonderful about these panels and wonderful about your books is, this is all new history to me. So I have lots of questions, and I want to let our audience know that I will be taking questions from the audience later on in the panel. So if you think of anything, go ahead and hang on to that, and then I'll ask for those questions in a little bit. For now, let's go back to Elaine. Elaine, you were born in Nigeria, is that right?
I was. Yeah.
So can you talk about how that contributed to this novel, your background, having been born in Nigeria, and how that relates to your character?
Yes, of course. I wouldn't have written this novel, certainly would not have placed it in Nigeria if I hadn't been born there and grown up there. It's a country I know in many ways more intimately than the US, because, if you're born somewhere and all your first memories and all your sensory experiences, I'm thinking about that mulberry tree, right? Are from a country, an equatorial African country, which is the largest Black population on the earth, then all your powerful first, sensory experiences, knowledge of the world is shaped there. Mm-hmm. So in some ways, for me, Nigeria is still the center of the globe, even though I've been in the US for a very long time now. It's set in the 60s. I was in Nigeria in the 60s. Part of the historical context of this novel is the lead up to a civil war in Nigeria. I was in Nigeria during that civil war. I lived there during that war. Saw the effects of it. and heard secondhand about things such as John F. Kennedy's death, which came in over the BBC and was brought into our house by a man who did some work in our in in our home and cooked for our family. He brought the radio into the house when the BBC was making the announcement and said, "Your president is dead." So, I mean, I didn't hear about it in an American school, right? I heard about it from there, but there was really the center. And so Nigeria is that first world for me. And but there is a difference in this book because my other books also touch Nigeria or are there a lot. I did not live in the North. I lived in the South, and that's kind of like the difference between New York and Florida. Nigeria is a country of 300 ethnicities and languages. It's hugely complex. Uh, I lived in the South, which was tropical and largely Christian, and this novel's in the North, which is largely arid and largely Muslim. So I did have to do a lot of research, and it was, I love that, and I'm sure we all love doing historical research. I mean, it's like you're on a treasure hunt.
Wow, thank you, Elaine. That's so interesting that you're able to bring that perspective into this novel and then share it with all of us. Let's go to Julia. Julia, I want to ask you about, you mentioned a spy element, but first maybe give us a little bit more about your main character, Amelia, what brings her to Paris, but then I'm really more curious about what's going on in Paris at that time that she even has this brought upon her.
Oh, I just love the 50s and 60s, and I'm a big fan of classic films and books set in that era. And so I just already loved the fashion and everything about it. So my character is a young woman who has been taking care of her father, who has recently passed away from cancer. So she's grieving, and she doesn't have siblings. Her mother died when she was very young. And so she's completely unmoored. And so when someone comes up and offers her this opportunity, she says no. Of course, she would never go. She couldn't leave her home. She has to find her own way forward there in Brooklyn. But as the days tick by and she's packing up her father's things, she realizes she doesn't have anything at all to hold her back or to have, to even count on. So she takes this job, and I'm a Francophile. I love France, and my husband's also a historical novelist. He writes books set in England, and I've written books set in England and France. And so we just love going to have a look at those streets and everything. It's just such a romantic time period in the 60s. But it was also interesting because it was, deep in the Cold War era. So World War II, the Allies and England won, but there was still so much going on behind the scenes, as there was such a race to get nuclear secrets and nuclear information. So you can imagine there was a great deal of research that went into this. And you're right. I love, Elaine, that you said it was a treasure hunt, because that's the way I feel too. I'm already interested in the place and the time, but the politics was a lot of fun. And Charles de Gaulle was back as president of France for the second time, just months before my book takes place, and right about the time that John F. Kennedy became president. So that's all, it all tied in really nicely. And so when you have a very young person who hasn't had a lot of experience in life, it is, everything is new. you're very trusting. You try to find your way. And so this is how she slides down that slippery slope into falling into the wrong hands. So that was a great deal of fun to write.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like that you're able to combine your interest in that place and fashion and then bring that intrigue in as well.
Mhm.
Well, Rosa, I want to ask you about the social context of Korea and Japan at that time. Obviously, things were different then, and it was surprising to me to hear that your character has to try and pass as Japanese as a Korean in Japan. So, can you talk more about the social context of that time and place?
Yes, I think it's so fascinating listening to this conversation because our books take place in, four different parts of the world, and yet our protagonists are struggling with the circumstances and events happening. My novel begins in 1928 in Korea. Japan occupied Korea from 1910 to 1945. So they were in the middle of the occupation, and she was a poor girl growing up in a broken family. And there were very few opportunities for girls. Girls didn't get educated until or past primary school. There was also a heavy American missionary influence in Korea, but especially in the north. So she was influenced early on by an American missionary who planted the idea that girls could have an education equal to boys. So when she gets this opportunity to study in Japan, she's very excited about it. But she's young and naive, and when she arrives, she is discriminated against based on her race. And the prejudices that exist in that society. When I was writing my book, I'm ethnically Korean. I did an ancestry and me test, and I discovered that I'm part Japanese as well, because trade and culture flowed from China to Korea to Japan, and so it's natural. But um, I was moved by how uh, in America you hear about blacks passing as white as light skinned, but we don't hear a lot about Asians passing as other Asians. And here was my grandmother doing this. And so I found some old documents. So what happens in the story is that she goes to Japan, she's discriminated against, she passes as Japanese, and then she actually, being the fiery spirited woman that she grew to be, she became a nurse, one of the very few licensed Japanese nurses licensed in Japan. But when I came upon her nursing certificate, it was all written in Japanese, but her surname obviously was um, her Korean name. And then she was also a midwife, so she earned her midwife certificate. So I just became curious about, like, why was she there? And then why was she using her, I mean, what happens when you use your Korean name and could she have used her Japanese name? Because they had the choice at that point to use a Japanese name or a Korean name. So she chose to adopt a Japanese name, and through that, she was able to obtain jobs and live a normal life. But at some point, she fell in love. She has a child, and she's worried that the future isn't bright for her son. And she wants him to embrace his heritage. And so something happens. She's actually drafted into the Japanese Imperial Army to be a nurse. And she's thinking to herself, I'm going to serve a country that has oppressed the Korean society for 35 years. And so that's sort of the climax of the book and sort of the setting in which this happens. And I think it's interesting, and I've discovered a lot about myself and her because she was an immigrant. I consider this an immigrant story. I myself, an immigrant from Korea, I came to Los Angeles when I was 7. So a lot of the experiences that she went through that I explain in the book and describe are her first days at school, her assimilation into Japanese society, my assimilation into American society. So I hope that my book uh, sheds light on this era of forgotten history.
Yeah, and what a great way to kind of get to know yourself and your own family while sharing that important history. Tiffany, let's talk more about your protagonist, Elizabeth Taylor Greenfield. I'm curious about, I don't think she's all that well known. I certainly have never heard of her. Why do you think she's not better known? How did you discover her story? And just how is her voice like so great that she broke through the extreme segregation of the time?
So I had never heard of her. And I am obsessed with opera music. I have been since I was a teenager. I was in a school district that um, I grew up in an urban area that was very, very dedicated to making sure children were exposed to the arts. So we had lots of theater, opera. When I was 18, I took a bus trip to Toronto to see the Phantom of the Opera, and I still listen to that soundtrack, even though that's not truly opera, but I still love that soundtrack. And when I was a teenager, I read an Anne Rice novel called Cry to Heaven, which is about the famous castrati um, of Italy. And that's where my obsession with opera music came from. So I was surprised that I had never heard of Elizabeth Taylor Greenfield because I loved Black opera singers. I knew Marian Anderson, Leontine Price, never had heard of Elizabeth Taylor Greenfield. She is an unsung hero and a hidden figure, I think only because of the time period when she sang. I mean, there were not as many records kept, and there are no surviving recordings of her voice, unfortunately. How I discovered her. So serendipitous. And when we're talking about these treasure hunts with historical fiction, I was actually researching my second historical fiction that comes out next year about W.E.B. Du Bois's daughter, Yolande Du Bois. And the father, W.E.B., had a record company called Black Swan Records. And it was named in tribute to Elizabeth Taylor Greenfield, the Black Swan. And I was like, well, who is she? And that day I fell down the rabbit hole of the Black Swan. And, she was talked about in the Frederick Douglass newspaper. And I just kept reading all about her. And I had a book that I'd written. It was completely fiction. It was not biographical historical fiction. It was called A Multitude of Sins, about, surprisingly enough, Rosa, it was about a opera singer who was passing as white in New Orleans. And my agent was just about to start shopping it. And I said, wait a minute, stop the presses. Do not shop that. I want to write about this real opera singer. And I'd done all this research about opera and about like how you prepare your voice and bel canto and all of these things. And so I wanted to use that research to bring to light this opera singer who I hadn't heard of, but she is well known in opera communities, particularly Black opera singers know Eliza well. And even later in life, Elizabeth Taylor Greenfield um, made it she made it her mission to mentor young opera singers after she stopped touring herself. She had the Black Swan Opera Troupe where she was mentoring young opera singers and making sure that they made it to the stage. So it was very important for her to do that. I was unable, of course, to hear her voice because like I said, there are no surviving recordings of her voice. But what I did have were concert programs of the songs that she sang. So what I did was I took the songs and I used the Google, and found other opera singers who sang those songs, and just to try to get a feel for what her concerts may have sounded like for someone who had those kind of vocals. And one song Eliza used to sing was called When Stars Are in the Quiet Skies. And it's all through my novel because she sang this song in just about every concert. And it's not even an opera song, but she loved the song because it was in almost every one of her concerts. And she used it to display her vocal range. She would sing it in a deep baritone. She would start it in baritone and would take it all the way up to her ear-splitting soprano. And I know this because of the reviewers. They would review her heavily in all the newspapers where she would go on tour. They would make a point to talk about how she sang this song. Lots of reviewers would think, oh, it's a trick. How did she sing it like this? Some, because her voice was so deep, it sounded like a man. And one reviewer said, if I was not looking with my own eyes, I would think it was ventriloquism or a trick. So because she sang that song so much, I threaded it through the entire book and used it because I said the song must mean something to her. The lyrics must have meant something to her. So I love that I was able to do at least that part of it. I hate that I couldn't hear that amazing voice, because for her to be a Black woman during a time where the Fugitive Slave Act allowed plantation owners to kidnap Black people and put them on plantations, whether they had been enslaved or not, for her to be able to have concerts that were sold out. And she performed to mostly all white audiences. And that was a big thing. That was one of the reasons why her shows were protested. Black people wanted her to be an activist. They wanted her to fight for the rights of Black people to attend her shows. And later in her career, she did move into an activist role. For her to be able to do that, her voice must have been amazing. I really wish I could have heard it because it must have been outstanding. And I'm so glad to have found her, and not just her, but the community that she lived in, because that little piece of America, Philadelphia in the antebellum, didn't look anything like a lot of America. I mean, you had the Quaker community. You had lots of free Blacks who were wealthy. You had the women of the Quaker community and the free Black women put together the Philadelphia Female Anti-Slavery Society, which was something that was completely unprecedented in the United States. And I love that looked so different. And it was kind of before its time. It was feminism, it was abolitionist, it was everything all wrapped up into one. And it was something Nikki Giovanni had said before she died in an interview, and it to me, it speaks to the spirit of this book. She said, in times of oppression, Black women always find a way to be joyful, no matter what's happening. This was a time when Black people in this country were oppressed. It was a dark time in our nation's history. This story, though, is not a story of oppression. This is a joyful story. And for me to be able to find a story of joy and triumph during such a dark time in our history, I'm happy to be able to present that story. Because for this to be my first historical fiction novel, I didn't want to write a story that wasn't joyful. And so finding this story during that time, I feel like that was a blessing.
Tiffany, I have to say that weaving the music in like that, I mean, it just lends so much authenticity and realness to the story. I love that so much. And music, just mentioned in books, makes it all so much richer.
Mm-hmm. I agree.
And universal.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's one thing that always fascinates me about the novels that feature singers is that it's a bit tricky. It's tricky to because like you can't hear it when you're reading, and of course, with a lot of those singers, we can go on YouTube and hear them. So it's unfortunate we can't hear Elizabeth, but yeah, how wonderful that you're able to bring that out on the page. I'm curious, you said this is your first historical novel, but now all of us here, having heard you talk about it, are you sure you're not like a historical novelist at heart?
So I so I think sometimes you find a thing and it's kind of it wakes up something in you because I've been writing for, like I said, 20 years. Well, before we started this, I've been in publishing. This will be my 20th year published. My first book was published in 2005. And this has just felt so fresh and so new to me. And I have so enjoyed this. My next historical fiction, I actually went and stayed in Harlem for 3 weeks in a hotel and read letters on microfiche in the library every day, and then ran back to my hotel room and wrote for hours into the night. I really love it. So I don't know. Maybe I am a historical writer at heart, but I still love sci-fi. So I don't know. Maybe I actually on my computer right now have a historical sci-fi proposal, but I have to convince my agent to shop it because I don't know. You guys, let's send positive vibes out there because she's kind of, I don't know. We'll send positive vibes for my agent. I hope she doesn't watch this because she's gonna get me.
Elaine, I want to ask you about what we just talked about, the importance of music in Tiffany's novel. You do the same thing with place, making place kind of a character in your novel. Can you talk about what that means and how you did that?
Of course. And I've been the one person who hasn't shown off my cover yet with my face. So you can put the face with the cover. I know it's also in another place on this evening's events. But so you won't need to talk about how place is a character. Sure. And I want to mention that my novel is about the arts. It's about music. I've got this Nigerian British musician in it, an artist, a woman who's an artist. There are all these arts in Nigeria that she discovers, and they're kind of. Do you all remember when Alice Walker wrote "In Search of Our Mother's Gardens," and she was writing about these sort of ordinary daily arts that Black women had participated in, and my grandmother did too. I mean, like quilting and all these arts that were not taken as arts, right? And so in Nigeria, there's so much weaving and pottery making and cloth and all these just gorgeous arts that are used every day, and that take up the novel gives them a lot of attention. But to talk about place, of course, I guess am I the one writer here who might be identified as a Southern writer? Not sure about that, but even though I'm writing about Nigeria, I'm a Southern writer because I'm writing it from the South, and I've lived here all of my adult life. And so place is supposed to always be important to Southern writers. So, Faulkner's always writing out of Waukena-Patawpah County, and Lee Smith is writing out of West Virginia, and so on and so forth. For me, something that I'm really interested in is how we are made out of the land. And I'm really interested in my writing, and this has to do with the style, the content, the characters, every element. I'm really interested in atmosphere. Like, what does it mean to a person, to a person's consciousness, to who they are and who they are becoming when they experience the harmattan, which is the Saharan dust, coming down over the land and seeing it cover everything and cover their laundry, and a white woman, cover her face and her hands, and so that she becomes a kind of light brown, or a child born to her. And here's a little plot point in my novel. My female character, after her little affair, becomes pregnant.
Knew it. I
And
knew it.
okay, wait for
Read this
it.
book.
Wait for it. Fraternal twins. Okay. To a child born there, as I was, to experience the frangipani tree, to eat the guava, not the peach, to swim in a cold, clear river, under tropical skies. I mean, I'm just really, really interested in not always how politics or historical events or family or whatever, but land invents us and makes us and gives us spirit and moves us to become who we are and leads us to our destiny. So I don't know that the land's a character. It's almost a goddess. It's a kind of force that can't be quantified. And so,
Yeah, that's really well said. I really enjoyed just listening to you describe those things. And I mean, talk about authenticity.
Mhm.
And before this, we were talking about where we're all from. One of you said that you had snow for the first time in 4 years. And meanwhile, I'm in, yeah,
that was,
meanwhile,
we had it on my launch night and had to cancel.
and I'm in Minneapolis where it's just an everyday thing for me. And in fact, I have my intern for history through fiction is from Uganda, and she said her dream is to see snow one day. And I just take it for granted. It just shows that importance of place. Well, I'm going to post the link again to our panelists' books in case anything has struck your fancy and you're like, oh, I definitely want this one. You can get all four if you want, but definitely go check those out. I also have plenty of more questions for our panelists. This is flying by, but I do want to invite questions from our audience. So if you have any questions for our panelists, please post those in the chat. I can't guarantee I'll get to all of them, but I'll do what I can. In the meantime, let me ask Julia another question. Tiffany brought up music and describing music, Elaine about describing place. Julia, you have to describe fashion, and I'm assuming you're not don't have an illustrated novel. So talk about painting a picture and describing fashion in your novel.
Oh, absolutely. That was really important to me that you could see it when you're reading it. The different fabrics. I walk you through the entire fashion house at the beginning of the story so you can get a bird's eye view into what exactly is happening in every different department so that it really makes it come alive and become real. But describing the clothes, that was something that I just had a wonderful time doing. And whenever I'm writing a novel, my first historical fiction was set in 1940. The second one was set in 1955 in Boston, and this one is set in 1960. I keep a Pinterest board, and I look for clothes, I look for books, I look for music, everything that I can find to inspire me. So I work off my inspiration board. I usually know what I want. For example, there's a diamond necklace in my story. I just created it. It just came to me, this diamond necklace. And so I have started searching for that sort of necklace that I had never personally seen. But it's a wonderful part of the research to get in there and to learn more about these things and to be able, and the challenge, but such a fun challenge to write about it. Of course, the novel also has, heavier aspects as it talks about, some of the interesting things about the Cold War. But speaking of fashion too, one of my favorite characters in the book is this 74-year-old woman, and she's very elegant. She's French. And I don't know if the rest of our fellow authors have this same experience that I have, but when I come up with an idea for a story and I do a little research and I begin to put it together, you start writing a little bit before you believe in it or believe in yourself. And when I was about 5 or 6 chapters in, and I went back and rewrote those chapters later, but when I got a little bit into it, I created this character, a 74-year-old elegant French woman who has a really integral part of the story. And I knew at the moment that she came out on the page that this was a book, that this was my story and this was the story I was telling. And so she also is just a little piece of the fashion and the spy element and the just the fun of the novel.
Thank you. And it must have been fun to look at some of that fashion and describe it for the readers.
Mm.
So I do have a few questions from our audience. I'm going to ask one from Lynn and one from iPhone Lauren that are essentially the same. So Lynn asks, I'm wondering how you deal with constraints when you write about once living people. And Lauren writes, because your protagonists are real people, did you take any major fictional alterations to your character's story? If so, what drove your decisions? As historical fiction writers, we all are told that our story must always come first. How do you reconcile that with historical truth as you find it? Tiffany, Rosa, either one of you want to hop on that one?
I'll jump in real quick. So my story is based on my grandmother. I interviewed her numerous times before she passed away. I was able to glean the sort of big arc of her story, but she was reluctant to talk about her past. It was traumatic, it was painful. She had a lot of secrets. So I eked out as much information as I could, and I actually wrote my novel originally as a family memoir or a biography. But I felt there were too many gaps, and I wanted to enrich the story to make her character come to life. She was so colorful and so strong and fiercely independent, and I wanted to understand where that came from. And I had to peel back the layers and go further and further back into her childhood. Because as we know, our formative years are our childhood years. And Elaine, when you talked about land and home, I was thinking like what was home for her and what grounded her. And they weren't necessarily uh, physical objects because she lost all of them during her displacement over time to different places. But I think food was always featured and is a big part of my novel. The traditions that are carried forward through food, and I talk about the custom of kimjang, which is making kimchi as a community, and it's now like a UNESCO. Recognized communal activity, and it's a community coming together, everyone doing their own part to make fermented cabbage to last through the winter, and they would bury it in the ground. So it's these traditions that I found most interesting in writing my book, is capturing them, remembering them, honoring them. So in terms of bringing the truth, how do you reconcile truth and fiction? It's not easy, but I was speaking to somebody else who had done this, and she's like, you almost have to forget the truth once you know the basic story, because it can really constrain you if you're trying to fit it into something. So as an artist, as a writer, you have to let go at a certain point of the bones of the story. If you have them, um, you have to now serve the story and not have the story serve you.
Rosa, I'm glad you said that. So basically, that's kind of my process. I
Yeah.
do the research and I let it kind of get in, and then I put it away. And
Yeah.
then I write the story. Like, so I know I've learned all about my protagonist, and then I approach it the way I would approach any other fiction story. I have a protagonist who has a goal, who's going to have something that she's going or he's going to learn by the end of the story. I'm going to have an antagonist or something or someone that they're going to be doing battle with over the course of the story. And then as I'm writing it, it's historical, so there are going to be details that I'm going to have to go back and grab. I'm not going to know the things that I don't know until I'm writing it. Like, oh, wait a minute, what did they call this thing? And then I'm going to go back and grab it. And for me, because I didn't really know a lot about the antebellum before I started writing this, I had to go back a lot. One thing that happened during my edits, I had to rewrite a whole section because I had started um, my editor asked me to do something, and I started reading a lot of articles from the British press that I hadn't had previously on Eliza. And I had thought, because I had one source document that said that she arrived in Great Britain alone. Well, I found something else that was a ship manifest that she didn't arrive alone. She had two people with her. She had staff that arrived with her, which actually was great for my story because I was stuck. And I was like, oh, great. She had people. This is wonderful. So it actually helped my story. But that's the research can sometimes help and it can sometimes constrain you. So it's not always, so it's a blessing sometimes to have those facts. It's not always the good thing about Eliza is that there wasn't as much. So for this to be my first historical fiction, I wasn't too pressed down with facts because there wasn't as much about her. They don't even know for sure when she was born because she was born on a plantation. And there were no records of her birth. So there's a range of years where she could have possibly been born. That was helpful to me because I was able to lean more into my fiction side. I do have a very extensive author's note at the end because I realized that I was taking liberties. She never married or had children. I have no idea of whether or not she took lovers. She did in my book. I don't know whether she did in real life, but so that the historical note in the back, the author's note in the back, explains the liberties that historical fiction authors take, especially when you're talking about a real person. Now, my next historical fiction novel about Yolande Du Bois, there is lots of information about her and her family, and so I had to take great care. And they are very well known in the Black community. So I had to take great care, but lots of what is known or they think is known is not correct. And I have letters to prove that it's not correct. So I'm actually looking forward to debunking myths when that book comes out. I'm looking forward to that. But it's, I don't know, maybe you're right, Colin. Maybe I am a historical writer, you
But
know.
you,
But
you,
yeah,
you, you
so
sound
it's
very
been interesting.
passionate. Well, and all history is revisionist to some degree because we're all adding on to the historiography and all learning from previous researchers, writers, and adding on to it and adding our own perspective, which actually there was Greg asked a question about that. Is heritage destiny in writing historical fiction? Are we projecting different versions of ourselves or are we presenting different perspectives of the history? So that's a pretty deep question about our own spin on things, our own contemporary views. Do you find yourselves doing that? How do you kind of divorce yourselves from it?
I'll
Any
jump
of
in
you?
on that one because I saw it written up in the chat. And my first historical novel was based on a diary of the first white American Baptist missionary to West Africa in 1853. Um, I I felt somewhat constrained because I had her diary and her story was known, right? Um, so but on the other hand, yes, all kinds of things are made up because she had created entries in her novel, I mean, excuse me, in her diary that seemed to me to need a whole novel to explain, right? They were so brief. Um, in in this novel, Dancing Woman, again, I'll show you my cover. Um, I do feel like, yeah, there's some of me projected into this novel because I create the heroine, right? Um, so that's, I think sometimes it depends, right, on who your who the character is, if it's a really true historical character, and and how much leeway you're going to give yourself.
Well, we're coming up on the end of the hour here, so I'm going to wrap things up. I do have one more question for each of you as we finish up the event here. I do want to say thank you to everyone who attended. Thank you to our wonderful panelists. This has been like a masterclass in historical fiction, and like I said, it has gone quick. So it's been really wonderful to hear all of your about all of your stories and the histories involved. And I hope everyone will have a chance to check out your books if they haven't already. I see some of our attendees have already read some of your books. I do want to remind people that if maybe you don't have, can't afford to get one of the books, you can still support these authors by requesting it at your local library or shouting out about it on social media, telling friends about these books. That will really help our authors to get their stories out there. So to end things tonight, I want to ask about the value of historical fiction. Our press is based solely on historical fiction, and it's clear that all of you have done a ton of research and could have written these stories in any way, but you chose to tell these stories through historical fiction. So what is the value of doing that, and what do people get out of historical fiction that they can't get somewhere else? Julia, do you want to start us off?
Oh, yeah, I'd love to. My first historical fiction book was written in set in 1940 through 1945. It was during World War II. And as we know, we kind of live in a polarized world right now where different parts of the country believe different things. And I really loved immersing myself in history from World War II. As a matter of fact, before I started writing that book, and it was called For Those Who Were Lost, it was published in 2022. And it's a story about children from Guernsey who their parents were given 24 hours notice whether they wanted to evacuate them from the country before that little island was occupied. And I thought, one of the things I love about historical fiction is not just learning about history, because I had never known about that event. As a longtime teacher and as a mother, I couldn't imagine what it would be like to have to make the tough decision about whether or not to send my child away for an indefinite period of years in order to keep them safe. And so just doing that, it let me realize I'm going back to a time where we all agreed what the enemy was, where we all agreed what truth was. And I really love the known knowns of that time. We all had our eye on the same prize. And I just feel like it's important to look to the past when we're trying to make our way through difficult times to get to the future and to hopefully bring the country back together as one. And historical fiction is a beautiful way, in my view, of doing that very thing and understanding the past to help us make great decisions about the future.
I swear that wasn't prepared. I did not tell Julia that was coming.
Thank you.
Um, Elaine, how about you? What's the value of historical fiction?
So I'll probably quote him erroneously, but Faulkner again, didn't he say something like it wasn't history isn't in the past. It's wait, no, I'm not getting it right, but something about basically the past isn't past, right? It's now. I mean, we write about the past, but through some uncanny, I don't know, through human nature, maybe we're always repeating ourselves. So I had no idea when I started writing my novel that USAID would suddenly be in the headlines, right? That this agency, which has been kind of a just ordinary part of American and global life, would suddenly be, I don't know, having this moment of discussion and controversy, right, about whether the United States is going to be a country that is participating in that kind of work around the globe. I grew up with people whose parents were with USAID. It was just life. This novel is also very feminist. And I don't think when I started it, I quite understood either that we would be fighting again for so many things that, I mean, I went to Washington in the DC in the 70s to march for the ERA and right. And so my whole trajectory as an adult has been kind of being a feminist, and now I'm an old feminist, except I have to become young again because we still have the fight, right? And so I think historical fiction keeps before us the struggles of our past and reminds us of what's valuable and what we have to hold to as true and essential to our humanity.
Yeah, definitely. Rosa, how about you, the value of historical fiction?
That's a really deep question and a hard one to nail down, but I think I've always loved historical fiction. My favorite book, ironically, or it explains a lot, is was A Tree Grows in Brooklyn, written by Betty Smith in the 1900s about a young girl a poor Irish girl coming of age in New York. And I saw myself in that story because there were no other stories of Asian girls growing up in America at that time. So I think finding ourselves in these characters is so magical and tells us something about humanity and how we're so much similar, more similar than we are different. And and that I hope that more books like this, where we haven't seen these kinds of characters or these kinds of settings before, will be explored and shared and celebrated. I don't think we've done enough in exploring historical fiction in certain parts of the world and in certain stories, especially of immigrants, and especially now when our policies are leaning towards wholesale deportation, wholesale, without really understanding that these are people with individual stories and that we all have them, and that we need to mark them, if not for now, for the future.
Yeah, it turns history from these obscure facts to real people, humanizes the people of today.
Yeah.
So Tiffany, how about you?
As I wrote about Elizabeth Taylor Greenfield, it just called to mind for me all of the liberties as a woman, as a Black woman, that I have in 2025. And even though there are things that, you know, I still would like to see, all of the liberties that I have, the things that Eliza did not have, um, if we do not recall the times past, and the things that we have fought for and struggled for, um, we could see those things lost, and just making sure that we remember the past, and the things that we've the victories that we've won, and the battles that our ancestors have fought, and not letting those um, victories be for naught. And Eliza was someone who was a champion, and every woman in this book, and it's not just the women, but this book is full of amazing women, amazing women and allies that Eliza had. Harriet Beecher Stowe, um, who was just amazing in helping Eliza. There were so many women in this book that shaped our future where we are today in 2025, and the fact that they were real people. And that is what I love about historical fiction, biographical historical fiction, that these are not people that I pulled out of my imagination. They existed, they were here, and they made a difference. And we read fiction for entertainment, but historical fiction teaches and enlightens and equips us. And so that's what I love about it.
Thank you. All of you answered that so eloquently and just reminded us how serious things can be. But at the same time, we had a really fun chat here tonight. It was really wonderful to hear about your work and the stories that you're able to tell. So it's been a really wonderful evening. And I'm so glad that I could have all of you on the panel. Thanks again to everyone who attended, and have a wonderful rest of your evening.
Thank you, Colin.
Thank you so much.
Colin. Thank you, ladies.